series that has been titled Inspired. And so if you've not been with us, essentially we've been looking at the question and the belief that we all want our life to count for something. That regardless of if you're younger or if you're older, regardless if you're someone who is a believer in Jesus or not, maybe you're someone here this morning just checking it out and just wondering, who is Jesus and what does this mean in my life? I think ultimately we want our life to count. We want to be able to make a difference. And so we've been looking at the question in terms of not whether or not we want to make a difference, but rather how does that begin to happen? How do we become inspired in such a way that we then live a life that is inspiring to others? How do we live in a life that is contagious in terms of people wanting to know more in terms of why we make the decisions we do or the choices we make? And so what does that begin to look like for us? And so each week we've tried to look at different characteristics of what I believe inspires inspiration. We began at the very beginning of looking at the reality that oftentimes what causes inspiration in our life as a catalyst are those moments in life that we may not have at first responded in the way we had wanted to. We found ourselves in a circumstance or a situation where we feel overwhelmed. And we begin to wonder, what is it that I could possibly do in the midst of this? But as we begin to look again from the perspective of what God puts in our life, I believe it's in these moments of where we may initially feel overwhelmed that God is actually leaning in. That God not only has a plan, but that he is looking to see who is going to join with him in terms of making a difference. And so reminded that, to be a person who is inspiring, we need to stop making excuses and begin looking for solutions. But we know that in order to take that next step, it's not just having that great idea, but then having the courage to step out, to have the courage to allow God to stretch you and to push us and to take us sometimes out of our state of comfort. And it becomes a tipping point. I believe it becomes a tipping point not only in the difference it will make in the lives of others, but ultimately it'll become a tipping point in our life. Perhaps for some of us this morning we're thinking, well, is God real? Is God making a difference in my life? And perhaps we need to pause and ask, am I allowing God to stretch me? Am I allowing God to build that sense of courage within me so that I will truly see the reality of how God can use me to do incredible things? And then last week and then this week, we're looking at, I think, the important question of, okay, then where does the church come into all of this? I mean, what value does the church add? Why do we bother coming on Sunday mornings or being a part of small groups? Because as you see throughout the history of God's people, great movements start perhaps with one or two people, but God wants to build a community of people to make a difference. And last week we looked at the same passage that we looked at here this morning, because I believe it's in this passage in Hebrews that we're given a great reminder as to why God values community. The first thing we looked at is just in verse 23, the fact that oftentimes we want to come together in community because there's many voices, there's many distractions, there's many other things vying for our attention. And so when we come together as a community, it's always with the express purpose of focusing upon Jesus, upon focusing upon the one who truly gives inspiration in the midst of all of life. We also learn that one of the great values of community is the encouragement that it brings alongside. I'm sure we've all found ourselves in circumstances, in situations, whether it's within the church or outside of the church, where we've been doing something and we just feel like we want to give up, and then someone comes alongside and just gives us those words of encouragement. And we're able to go beyond what perhaps we would have done on our own. And that's what we want church to be. As we talked about last week, church is not this building. Church are the people who desire to follow in the movement of Jesus. And so we want to knock down the distractions. We want to knock down everything else that may interfere with focusing upon Jesus and upon being an encouragement to one another so that we'll begin to see what God is going to do. But there's one final characteristic that I think is incredibly important. That if you begin to think of people that are inspiring, people that, or organizations that you just look to and are so impressed by, I think there's one characteristic that pulls them all together. And that is simply this: they are other-focused. They don't just simply focus upon their own needs, but rather they see themselves, they see their organization, they see their lives as an opportunity to meet the needs of others. Even to a place where they are willing to sacrifice perhaps their own comfort, their own pleasure, their own good things in life for the basis of others. I was reading this past week again just about some of the incredible work that Mother Teresa has done. And you think of this woman who started out in such a simple beginning, going to Calcutta, India, into the slums of one of the poorest places in the world. And what I find interesting, whenever you listen to interviews and you see people asking Mother Teresa, the constant question is always like, well, like, how did you get started? Like, how did you honestly think you were going to make such a big difference? And almost all the time, her response was, I saw a need of how I could serve someone else. And I think what's truly inspiring about Mother Teresa and many other people in the history of this world is how they chose to serve others, even at a cost to themselves. And so we start to think of our own lives, as we start to think of the church. Do we have that same perspective? Do we see the church as an opportunity to gather together, not simply to meet our needs, but to rather to begin to meet the needs of others? Because I think a lot of the times when people hear the word church, there's a lot of baggage attached to it. And I think it's primarily because of this reason. People wonder, well, what good is the church? Is the church really reaching into the community? And too often we become too insider-focused, focusing upon ourselves and upon our own needs, that we're not reaching into the communities around us. And so if that is what is needed, what is the catalyst? What is the little poke that we need in order to get beyond what I've heard others refer to as like the holy huddle and begin reaching into the communities around us? I believe it's found in this passage in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. So I want to read it here for you this morning. Thanks for bearing with me here. In verse 24, again, the context of Hebrews is coming at a time where the first part of the book has all been focusing upon what Jesus has done. And then it comes to a place of then saying, okay, then how can we respond? And we read this in verse 24. It says, and let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds. And I find it rather interesting, the language of that verse. That's the verse we're just going to focus on here this morning. It talks about the role of the church as being that in which of provoking one another to do love and to show good deeds. Other translations will say spur, how can we push? But basically, how do we poke each other? How do we provoke one another towards love and good deeds? I think what's interesting is to understand the context of this passage, because sometimes we can read the Bible and we can just kind of pull a verse out and we lose the full meaning without understanding the context in which it was written. The book of Hebrews, it's believed, was written about 40 years after Jesus' resurrection. And so we're into the second generation of followers of Jesus. And things were not going well for them in many ways, because they were facing severe persecution. If you know your history, in about 64 AD, when Nero was the Roman emperor, he had a hate-on for Christians. He was blaming Christians for many of the problems that were happening within the Roman Empire. And so he was persecuting them, he was killing them, he was using them to basically light the streets in his gardens. And so it's in that context where things are not going well for the early followers of Jesus that we come across this verse. And you start to understand just the significance of the language, that they need to provoke one another to show love and to do good. It kind of makes sense. If you're living in a society where you are being persecuted because of what you believe, you may be tempted to say, okay, listen, I'm going to still believe in Jesus. I'm still going to follow Jesus, but I'm going to kind of keep it a little private. I'm going to keep it to myself. And what do we see the church coming around and saying? No. Faith is always personal, but it's never private. That we're going to provoke you. We're going to push you in a direction that you may not have gone otherwise. Because that's what Jesus wants us to do. I mean, you look at the teachings of Jesus and you realize right off the hop that Jesus is always raising the standard. 40 years earlier, it was Jesus who taught, you know what? Don't just love people who are kind to you. Don't just love people who are going to love you. I want you to love your enemies. I want you to pray for those who persecute you. And time again, we see Jesus speaking into the reality that if we're honestly going to take Jesus at his word, it's not easy. It's situations where we may want to turn away and run from. I think the example of forgiveness, where we're told to forgive one another. And anyone here this morning knows that when you have been burned by someone else, forgiveness is not easy. And so as a church, what do? We have to provoke one another so that we will live the life of love, that we will act in a way that truly shows the goodness of God, not simply when we feel like it. I was reminded of it this past summer, that oftentimes we need a push to do things we otherwise wouldn't have done on our own. As a family, we went ziplining. And those of you familiar with ziplining understand the concept of basically put a harness on your body with a clip, and then there's these massive wires from tree to tree, and you go up on these platforms a couple hundred feet up. Well, we decided to do this as a family. And the first few times, you kind of got to steady yourself a little bit. And a little disclosure, I don't like heights. Like, heights are not, you people up in the balcony, good on you. I would not be sitting up there, right? I'd be like, ooh. I do not love heights. And so put me up on a platform a couple hundred feet up in the air, and I'm thinking, okay, so I paid money for some dude to clip me to a wire and then let me roll from one tree to the next. I wanted to tell the guys how much I was going to tip them in advance just so that they made sure they caught me at the other end, right? And so we're going along, and everything's going well. The first few go well, and I'm getting my confidence because they just hook you up, and then you kind of lean back into a ball, and then you just kind of slowly pick your momentum and go. Well, by about the 11th or 12th, we started to come towards the end, and we came to this one platform, and I noticed there was two wires. There was one at normal chest height, and then there was another one about another 8 to 10 feet higher with a wire coming down. And I thought, I wonder what that's all about. Well, I didn't have to think for too long, because here was the opportunity. This was like the bonus zip line, where instead of going in the casual way on your back, you apparently had a clip on the back of your back, and they could hook you on that, and you jump off the platform, you fall, probably not too big, but it seemed like a lot. You fall, and then it catches, and then you go Superman across this massive cavern, right? And then to add to it, the guy says, listen, children can't do it because it's a little dangerous for them, so only the adults can do it. So I'm like, okay, think quick, Sherbino, what are you going to do? Well, I'm a gentleman in everything, and so I turned to my wife and said, Rebecca, why don't you go first? thinking, please God, let her not choose the Superman. Well, if any of you know my wife, Rebecca, she was like, grabbed the clip, locked it on, jumped off, and away she went. And I'm like, this is not good. This is not good. And so I think the guide could sense fear in me. And so he says, don't worry, it's going to be okay. And my 3 kids are standing next to me going, okay, Dad, you can do it too. And I'm like, not convinced, but all right. And so he grabbed it, and I was like, okay, so here's the deal. We're going to count 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to go. Is that right? He goes, yeah, absolutely. Clips me in. I'm like, okay, 1, and whoosh, he pushed me right off the platform. I think a couple bad words might have been said. I can't confirm. But as I'm falling down and going across something, I was like, hey, this is actually a lot of fun. And I was reminded that oftentimes in life, we need that little push to get us going. And so what if we started to view the church as in some ways an opportunity for us to gather together, not only to focus upon Jesus, not only to be an encouragement to one another, but one of the primary realities is that we are to give each other a push. We are to give each other a poke. We are to prod one another to go beyond what we may have done on our own. Because I believe that's what God wants for us, why he calls us to come together as a community, is so that we will begin to push the barriers, to go beyond what may have been comfortable. And at times, if we're being honest, we need that little push to get us where I think God wants us to go. And so how does it happen? I think one of the ways we begin to provoke and to prod one another is to always be reminded of Jesus' perspective upon others. Is whenever we read the Bible, whenever we read the teachings of Jesus, do we see it as an opportunity where God is prodding us, where God is pushing us to do something that we may not have done otherwise? A couple great stories that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 15. And if you have a Bible, or if you want to use one of the Bibles in front of you, you can open it up. We're just going to kind of go through it quickly. But it's in Luke chapter 15. And it's here that Jesus is telling 3 stories. And we're going to focus on just 2 of them. It's on page 78 in these Bibles here. And it's at a time where people are coming to Jesus and wanting to follow Jesus. But it's not your typical religious people. In Jesus' day, there was this group of people called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were incredibly religious and devout people and followers of God, except they're the ones that Jesus often had the greatest problems with. And here we see one of the examples of why. Because there's people who are following Jesus and are interested in Jesus that they don't approve of. And we see it right in the first couple of verses where the Pharisees are muttering, kind of grumbling. And they're muttering about who Jesus is hanging out with. And they give these great classifications. They call them sinners and tax collectors. Tax collectors must have been real bad because they get their own category all in of itself. But the Pharisees would view a sinner as anyone who failed to follow in the ways of God. And so they saw themselves as being righteous and being right with God, and because they followed everything that God had laid out for them. And so anyone who didn't would be considered a sinner. And they're having a problem with Jesus because Jesus is now hanging out with these sinners, these people who aren't following in the ways of God. And what we see happening is Jesus wanting to knock down an unhelpful distinction of us and them. That those who follow in the ways of God, we're the us people. And anyone who doesn't follow in the ways of God are the them. And so there's 2 categories of people in the world. And what does Jesus do? He knocks that idea flat on its face. He tells them 2 stories. He says, imagine you own 100 sheep. And 99 are safe, but one of them goes missing. Aren't you going to go and find that one sheep? And when you find that sheep, won't you bring it back and you put it on your arms, around your neck, and you'll be happy and you'll be celebrating? Wouldn't you do that? And then he says, or imagine you're a woman who has 10 coins, and she loses one of them, won't she turn on the light? Won't she sweep the floor? Won't she begin to look and turn over everything in order to find that one lost coin? And it's here that Jesus then makes the connection. Jesus says, people who don't know me, people who choose to not follow in the ways of God, I care about them so much that I'm actually going to set aside the people who have chosen to follow me in order to pursue the one who has yet made that decision. You begin to realize that oftentimes what God wants to do for us as a church is to poke us and to provoke us to step outside of the places of comfort and to go and to pursue others who do not know him, so they too will have this incredible, abundant life. But I think what Jesus is reminding us of is that our level of pursuit will be determined by the value we place upon that which is lost. If you ever lose something of, it's kind of nice, but it's rather insignificant. If you're driving your car and you have a couple bucks in your pocket and it falls out in between the cracks of the seat and you look for it and you can't find it and you think, it's okay, it's not that big of a deal. You don't spend a lot of time or a lot of energy or a lot of passion on things that you determine as not being valuable to you. If you have a little child or a grandchild and they're about to go to bed and they can't find that one special toy or blanket, even though you may understand the value is not that great, what are you doing for the next 45 minutes? You are tearing your house apart because to that child, it is of great value. What if you lose your wallet or your cell phone? What do? You put everything on hold and begin to look for it, try to find it, and you're not worrying about, well, you know what? I've got 3 other credit cards, or I've got $20 in my pocket, that's okay, or I can get another phone. No, you start looking and looking and looking. But even with that example, it eventually falls down, because if you don't find it, you just kind of move on. As a parent, I have 3 children. And if one of them goes missing for a moment in the mall, they didn't follow my instructions of don't wander off. And what do? They wander off. As a parent, am I going to say, well, you know what, 2 out of 3 ain't bad? Right? Even though it wasn't my fault, you pursue and you find that child, and there's that sense of joy and relief that your wife is not going to murder you when you found them. I believe that is the greater parallel to what Jesus is speaking of when he talks of those who do not yet know him. That they are that valuable, they are that precious, that he will do whatever it takes, even give his own life to bring them back. And so the place that I'm challenged with is, do I carry that same sense of passion? Do I carry that same sense of desire, of willing to sacrifice and perhaps put my own comfort on the side in order to pursue those who do not know Jesus? I think one of the primary functions we have as a church is to be a place where we are encouraged, but to be a place where we are prodded and provoked to show love and good to others in our community, to do the things that we may not have done on our own. And so we need each other. We need you as individuals to be bringing up ideas and opportunities for how we can make a difference so that we don't become too comfortable. We don't just kind of sit back and wait, but that we see it as opportunities to be stepping out. As a church, we want to build a community where we are pushing the margins, we are pushing the boundaries so that we are stepping out in new and fresh ways. That's why we do some of the things that we do here. That's why we always turn and read from the Bible. It's so that we will be pushed by Jesus to step beyond what may have been comfortable. That's why we take up the offering every Sunday. If Maybe you haven't looked at it this way. If you're someone that's new here this morning, if you're someone who's never been to church and you're still trying to figure it out, don't put anything in the offering. Feel under no obligation, because when people give, it's people who have said, you know what, Jesus, I want to follow you, and I'm going to be pushed to give my money to help benefit the lives of others. And that's why we give. It's not to keep the lights on and this place warm. It's a nice side benefit. But the reality is we give in order to bring the good news of Jesus into the lives of others. And so every time we give, it is a bit of a push. We're provoked a little bit because we know we have challenges. We have other bills. We have other things we could be spending our money on. But that's why we do it every week, is to see it as an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of others. And it's incredible to see. If you go to that table, the welcome table over there, you'll see a brochure on teamwork, and you see the variety of ministries that are happening because of the generosity of this church. The lives that are being touched, the love and the good that is happening because you have given and others have been provoked to do incredible things. One of the more recent ministries of this church is the Raw Carrot, a ministry that was begun to reach out to those who otherwise could not find employment in a regular work environment. People who are on Ontario Works or on ODSP, on disability, that just simply who want to work but just could not work the regular amount of hours at the regular pace. And it's incredible to see the impact that it has had. I know this past summer there's been various videos that have been shown, but I want to show you just the last one here today. And to see the impact, the love, and the good that has happened because you have given on a regular basis. Let's take a look.
Yeah, the rutabaga is the hard one to cut. But we use a lot of carrots. Yes, coming to work, it makes me happy because I get to hang out with people I like and gives me something to do instead of being bored. It's changed my life by giving me more money to help with bills, food. I have pets, I spend it on my dogs, I spend it on groceries for food to eat, and sometimes my mom. This is the type of job I like to do besides working with kids. Some days we have to put on a happy face if we're not too happy because of what else is going on in our life. But other than that, it's pretty happy in there.
And so that's just one of the many stories of the impact that has happened because you have been provoked, you have been prodded to give. It wouldn't happen if you don't give. None of the ministries of this church would happen if you don't give. And so we want to continue to poke, we want to continue to prod, and we want to sometimes touch on those sensitive subjects because we believe that that's what Jesus wants us to be talking about. Second way I want to kind of prod you here this morning is you look at this card on heart attack. You can do one of two things. You can do a couple things. You can leave it behind, you can bring it home and not do anything else about it. You can think about it, or you can use it as a way to invite someone else to come and join you on a Sunday morning. Again, our goal is not to just fill this place. It's not about just getting people to church. It's about bringing them to an environment where they can learn more about Jesus and to see the impact that he can make in their life. But it's got to take you out of your comfort zone. And so would you consider in the next 2 weeks giving this and inviting and bringing someone to come and to join you on a Sunday morning so that they can see the impact of not only Jesus in your life, but hopefully in their life as well. See, we want to come to church to be encouraged, but we also want to come to church to be poked and to be pushed a little bit as well. And so that's full disclosure. On a Sunday morning, we will be encouraged. We will focus on Jesus, but we're also going to poke you at times, make us a little uncomfortable at times, because that's how growth happens. That's how inspiration begins. That's how lives are changed. And so as we think of those words in the book of Hebrews, let us provoke one another to love and good deeds. Because when we do, lives are changed. Lives are changed. At this time, it's time for offering.